Hello, this is Marcia Levenstein. I'm a senior advisor to Vivli. I'm here today to talk about analysis-ready datasets and individual participant datasets, how they're different and how you can best use them. Okay, so today's agenda is, first we'll go over the problem, why it matters to you, give you some examples so you really understand better what the difference is between analysis data sets and IPD data sets, and then we'll summarize what I've said to you when we're done. So the problem is individual level clinical trials data sets can be provided one of two ways, either as IPD or as AD. IPD is individual participant level data, and that refers to the raw data that's provided in the case report form, and it really links directly to data as collected in the case report form. Analysis data contains the data for each individual participant also at the same level, but those data have been processed, and those are the data that are actually used to run the analytical programs by the sponsor that support either the report or the publication that you look at. It's important for you to understand the differences between these kinds of data so that you can really select and get the best data that meets your needs for your particular research purposes. So to be consistent with a previous analysis, if that's your intent to reproduce analysis, you really need to fully understand what data handling conventions have been used. You need to understand the derivations of any data sets, how missing values have been imputed or excluded, how data has been coded, what visit assignments have been used, and how inclusion flags have been used to include or exclude particular patients or visits within an analysis. If you want to reproduce an existing analysis, using the analysis data set is best suited for that purpose. On the other hand, if you want to define perhaps a new analysis data set, or even if you want to go through the process yourself to make sure you can reproduce at a more basic level an analysis that's completed, if you want to calculate derived variables, perhaps use different missing data algorithms and handling methods, then you should really start with the IPD. And in particular, if you want to analyze data that's not previously reported, you should start with the individual patient data so that you can actually get your hands on that data. So I'll give you a couple of examples. This first example, we really look at selecting a final visit. This is going to be the most extensive example that I have. So in this example, a study collects the primary variable, in this case, diastolic blood pressure, at each of 3 visits. The patient comes for 3 visits. The value for diastolic blood pressure, which is used for the analysis, is the average of the 2 values that are measured at each visit. The primary analysis is changed from baseline at the final visit for all participants who took at least 1 dose of study medication and had at least 1 follow-up visit so that there was an observation that could be analyzed. What you have to do in using the analysis data set, and one of the real differences is that the final data set is defined and analyzed and included in the analysis data set. The IPD data sets include all of the readings, not the averages, also include all the values that are measured, not necessarily the final. The analysis data set includes the average baseline data set, diastolic blood pressure, the final visit average diastolic pressure, change from baseline between those 2 average DBPs. Therefore, the analysis data set will either include participants who are included in the analysis, or potentially it may include all the participants with inclusion flags for various analysis populations. If you look in this slide, we'll show you what the IPD data set will look at for a very simplified set of data. So you see that there are 3 patients included in this data set. Each patient has 3 visits, or potentially 3 visits scheduled. The first visit is the baseline visit, and you can see they have 2 blood pressure readings at each visit. So the first 2 patients have visits at baseline, week 6, and the final visit. The third patient has only data at baseline in week 6, and the final data visit is missing, and the values are missing. So the IPD database contains all this information. You can see clearly when a patient attended and what their values were. The analysis data set, on the other hand, includes 1 record for each patient. It includes the average baseline blood pressure, the average final visit blood pressure, and then the difference between those two. And you can see for patient 3, because there was no visit 3, the visit 2 value is used as the final visit, and therefore that's what's included as the final visit, and that's what you use to find the difference. So that's a real difference between the two different data sets that you use. Second example, the variable is a patient-reported outcome instrument. So it's a multiple item rating scale, such as the SF-36 or perhaps the Hamilton Depression Score. The data that is collected and presented in the IPD would be each of the individual items collected at each of the visits. The IPD dataset includes all of the individual items, as I said, at every visit. The analysis dataset would include information after algorithms are applied, and those include algorithms such as calculating summary items, so taking the items that are required to to create the factors and calculate the factors, adding them up, incorporating any missing data handling, so that if missing data are available, whatever rules are put in place for that variable, they would be followed and they would be used to calculate the item factor analyses. Creating analysis populations at relevant visits and for relevant patients, and then calculating changes from baseline. If you have the analysis data set, then the analysis that you want to do can be performed directly using the calculated derived variables, rather than you having to reproduce and understand each of those algorithms and missing data handling methods yourself. This would certainly be a simpler way to analyze the data. In the next analysis, the next example, we also have another endpoint that's composed of other endpoints, but it's different in that this time we have a survival endpoint. The endpoint is MACE, which is Major Adverse Cardiac Event. So this includes total death, myocardial infarction, coronary revascularization, stroke, and hospitalization. And the variable would be really the first time to any one of those particular events. So the IPD dataset includes the occurrence and the date of each of these kinds of events, or the occurrences at visits if the events happened. The analysis data would include outcomes from applying algorithms such that you measure the time to each kind of event. You would also have the time to the first of any of those events. And therefore, this is the variable that would be needed to recreate any analysis that's reported from the study. So again, the analyses can be run easily on the derived variables. If you want to derive them yourself and to some extent reproduce the analysis from the start, you could start with the IPD dataset, but it's more difficult. You need to understand each of these conventions that's used to create the analysis variables. So some of the differences between IPD and AD are fairly straightforward. IPD are usually a simple mapping from the case report form, the data as collected at every visit and every value. Every item is individually collected and presented. Analysis data sets are much more complex because they use algorithms and data handling specifications to create derived variables and identify different populations. So without understanding or having the specific rules and formula used, there may be misinterpretations if you use analysis data sets or if you want to recreate them. So some of the things to think about when you're requesting data and the format you want your data in, if you want to derive the analysis variables yourself, you should start with the IPD. That's the rawest form of the data. If you want to define the inclusion criteria for participants, particularly if you want to change some of the assumptions or change the way the populations are defined compared to what the sponsor has done, you also should start with the IPD. If you want to, say, test your programs to reproduce the analysis performed by the sponsor, then you should start with the analysis data set. That's the closest that you'll be to using the specific and exact data that the sponsor used initially. So analysis data sets are generally the most useful sets of data to share from a trial. They have large benefits that are available to science and society. They really allow reanalysis more simply and more straightforwardly, meta-analyses, and scientific discovery through hypothesis generation. If you're looking for a new variable that hasn't been analyzed before, though, you're much more likely to be successful if you start with the IPD, because that may include variables that were not available as part of analysis data sets since they haven't been presented in analyses previously by the sponsor.